The U.S. shifts its focus from Afghanistan to China and pulls troops from the region. Secretary of State Blinken says that's because threats to the U.S. have moved. Australia seems to have taken sides. In the event of war between China and Taiwan, Australia would be likely to come to Taiwan's aid, together with the U.S. Will Beijing really attack Taiwan? A Japanese expert breaks down the Chinese regime's pros and cons list for a possible invasion. An experiment has engineered the world's first ever human monkey embryo, but the unusual experiment is now raising a number of ethical concerns. And human rights lawyers in China work arguably one of the riskiest jobs out there. One of them, who just escaped China, spoke to us about his experience. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. The U.S. is redirecting military forces and resources from Afghanistan to China as it prepares to pull U.S. troops from the region. Secretary of State Antony Blinken defends the move, saying that the terrorism threat has moved to other places. NTD's Don Ma has more.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken says the U.S. is shifting focus from Afghanistan to China. He responded to comments this weekend about President Biden's decision to remove troops from Afghanistan. On Sunday, he told ABC's This Week that Afghanistan is not as big a threat anymore and that it's time for the U.S. to redirect resources elsewhere.
The terrorism threat has moved to other places, and we have other very important items on our agenda, including the relationship with China, including dealing with everything from climate change.
But China's foreign ministry wasn't pleased with the statement. Responding to U.S. comments linking the removal to China, a spokesman called the message detrimental to trust and cooperation between the U.S. and China. Last Wednesday, Biden announced that all U.S. troops will be pulled out of Afghanistan by September 11th. He says that it's time to end the forever war. September 11th marks 20 years since the terrorist organization Al-Qaeda attacked the United States. 9/11 was a major factor behind sending U.S. troops to Afghanistan 2 decades ago. The move to withdraw U.S. troops has raised concerns that terrorist groups could once again expand in Afghanistan. In the interview, Blinken offered reassurance that things have changed in Afghanistan. He added that the U.S. will continue to monitor the situation and will provide support if needed. Mirroring Biden's announcement, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, known as NATO, agreed to withdraw troops as well. Around 7,000 troops from mainly NATO countries will also leave Afghanistan by September 11th. Don Ma, NTD News.
Australia is setting up preparations for potential conflict, but not its own. Instead, it's gearing up for the possibility of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan and the expected U.S. intervention. Unnamed sources have told the Australian Financial Review that the Australian Defence Force is getting ready for a worst-case scenario clash between the United States and China over Taiwan. This has led to speculation over how Australia would respond in the event of a war. The Australian Financial Review suggests that involvement could see Canberra sending in military support to its allies. That includes dispatching submarines, airborne refuelers, or fighter jets. Last week, former Australian Defence Minister Christopher Pyne predicted that a war over Taiwan is likely within the next 5 to 10 years. He says this isn't rhetoric. This is something that you and I may well have to confront in the next 5 to 10 years. Australia is part of a Quad alliance with the U.S., Japan, and India, but it seems unlikely the latter two countries would get involved if war broke out. Last week, the Australian side questioned the heads of the Indian and Japanese militaries about the topic, but neither responded. Beijing has been flexing its muscles at Taiwan, but is the Chinese regime really going to invade the democratic island? A Japanese expert explains. NTD's Juliet Song reports.
After the Japanese Prime Minister's visit to the U.S., many believe that Japan is now taking a harder stance against Beijing. But a Japanese expert holds a different view.
Japanese politicians are just trying to showcase a tough stance on China, but there's not much action. In terms of politics, Japan is with the United States, but in terms of the economy, Japan has intricate ties with China.
Shibuya says China is still a huge market for Japan. About 1,700 Japanese companies operating in China have applied for Japanese government aid to relocate. But that's only about 5% of the 30,000 Japanese companies in China. Shibuya also believes Beijing is unlikely to overtake Taiwan by force, because the Chinese regime would prefer to win a war without actual military confrontation. That means subverting an enemy through various other means,
such as spreading disinformation in the enemy state, sending bribes, or setting up honey traps. They create a state of chaos in the enemy state. That's exactly what they're good at.
He also thinks for Beijing, a war on Taiwan means a war on the U.S. The United States never committed to protecting Taiwan in the case of a Chinese invasion. But Secretary of State Antony Blinken also said that the Biden administration would make sure Taiwan has the ability to defend itself.
I don't think China wants to see a war between the US and China. That's because China has too few allies.
Shibuya says in the case of an invasion, U.S. allies such as Japan and Australia are likely to come to the rescue. But he doesn't believe Russia would support the Chinese regime. As for Iran and Pakistan, it's unclear if they would show support. But he thinks these countries wouldn't want to get involved in a war.
The Chinese side basically has no allies, but the American and Taiwanese side has quite a few allies that will support them. No matter how you look at it, the Chinese side is in an unfavorable situation.
He adds that Taiwan also has the ability to strike back. The island has missiles that are able to strike China's Three Gorges Dam. And if the dam collapses, it could release enough water to submerge the cities downstream. The area downstream has a dense population and is a major part of China's economy. So China could suffer huge damage from Taiwan's missile attack. This is why Shibuya thinks a war on Taiwan isn't an easy choice for Beijing. Juliet Song, NTD News.
The topic of Taiwan appears to be gaining traction in Japan. In a photo circulating on Twitter, 4 Japanese news outlets mentioned Taiwan on their front pages last Sunday. The headlines touched on an important development, that U.S. and Japanese leaders mentioned the island in a joint statement last week. It's the first time they've done so in more than 50 years. The U.S., Japan, and Australia are joining forces on a new major project. The nations plan to lay new submarine cables in the Pacific Ocean, according to Japanese media Yomiuri News. The move seems to strengthen global digital infrastructure and will allow the 3 countries to share information more efficiently. The increased communication will likely help the allies combat Beijing. Currently, 90% of submarine cables are owned by entities based in the U.S., Japan, and Europe. But China's submarine manufacturer HMN Tech comes in at number 4 in the world. The company is owned by controversial telecom giant Huawei. Huawei's ties to the Chinese regime have prompted concerns about using HMN Tech gear. Some warn that information transmitted via the Chinese-owned lines may be intercepted or obscured. Officials from the U.S., Japan, and Australia met with related companies in March to discuss the project. All parties agreed to strengthen cooperation. They also put forward a plan to co-finance construction of the submarine cables in areas of strategic importance. Expanding these cable lines is also part of the Chinese regime's Belt and Road Initiative, especially around the Pacific Islands. The area is known to have friendly relations with Taiwan. The Belt and Road is Beijing's main infrastructure project, known for partnering with foreign countries and funding overseas construction projects. Critics say the program aims to spread Beijing's influence by trapping developing countries in debt. Much of the submarine expansion effort is carried out by Chinese companies, not central authorities. Many believe the regime hands out subsidies to domestic companies, allowing them to take bids at lower prices and unfairly compete with foreign competitors. The U.S. intelligence community now recognizes the Chinese regime as the top threat to our national security. On Monday, former Director of National Intelligence John Ratcliffe shared how he thinks the U.S. should strengthen its national intelligence to meet the challenge.
Unfortunately, what worries me most about China now is that they've got a lot of momentum. They didn't just become our #1 adversary overnight. We should have been talking about China, I think, more honestly, more candidly.
During an event on Monday, John Ratcliffe discussed the recently released annual threat assessment by the U.S. Intelligence Committee and shared his view on the China challenges in the fields of military, economy, and technology.
What worries me most is on the technological front. China sees, as do all of our competitors, that is more of an equalizer and that the other two are more dependent on that.
Ratcliffe is one who added the U.S. Space Force as a new part of the intelligence community. He believes that the U.S. does not have a close competitor in that important field and needs to maintain their position as the best in the world. He also pointed out that the U.S. needs to invest more in getting the right people and best technology and strengthen its capabilities in the cyber arena. Recent cases, such as the attack on SolarWinds, shows the vulnerability of the U.S.'s cyber defenses.
The NSA and the CIA are precluded from a domestic standpoint of using these authorities, and we trust DHS and the FBI to be the first line of defense with regard to some of these events that I've talked about, and the capability just isn't there.
He also emphasized the importance of information sharing among U.S. intelligence community to strengthen its overall capabilities.
The U.S. and China agree on a new climate control pledge. They'll try to work together on what they call an urgent matter, despite heated tensions. NTD's Don Ma has more.
Despite souring tensions between the U.S. and China, the two sides have agreed to work together on climate control. The cooperation has been classified as urgent. They reached the agreement during talks in Shanghai last week. That's where U.S.'s climate envoy, John Kerry, met with his Chinese counterpart. The agreement comes as a joint statement. It reads that the two countries are committed to cooperating with each other and with other countries to tackle the climate crisis, which must be addressed with the seriousness and urgency that it demands. Kerry says the language in the statement is strong, but it seems he might have doubts on whether China will deliver on its promises. Kerry says he learned in diplomacy that you don't put your back on words, you put actions, adding that we all need to see what happens. But the outlook isn't looking good. In an interview with the Associated Press last Friday, Chinese Vice Foreign Minister Li Yucheng said that asking China to do more on climate control isn't realistic. He said, for a big country with 1.4 billion people, these goals are not easily delivered. China is currently the world's biggest carbon dioxide emitter. It aims to peak its emissions by 2030 and reach carbon neutrality by 2060, but the US and other countries are pushing China to achieve its goals earlier. A China affairs expert and professor at the University of Technology, Sydney, also echoes the concern. He tells us that he doesn't believe China will keep its word, saying even if Xi Jinping makes a promise in regards to China's carbon dioxide emissions, the Chinese Communist Party has always been unfaithful to its word in the international community, so his promises are not credible. China does have a history of breaking its word on agreements. It has yet to live up on its promises under last year's Phase 1 trade deal with the US. Under that deal, China pledged to purchase an additional $200 billion worth of U.S. goods and services between 2020 and 2021. That's compared to 2017 levels. So far, China has only lived up to a third of that pledge. President Biden will convene a global climate summit next week. Leaders of 40 countries will attend. It's still unknown if Chinese leader Xi Jinping will be there. Don Ma, NTD News.
Chinese and U.S. researchers recently created the first human monkey embryo in the world. But the experiment has also raised some ethical concerns. Over 20 scientists took part in the experiment. 17 of them work at China's Kunming University of Science and Technology. The other 3 are from the U.S. and Spain. The lead scientist, Hao Tang, reportedly said they did the experiment in China. That's because monkey embryos are expensive and rare, but they could be found in China. And such experiments can't be funded with U.S. federal research dollars. The team put human stem cells into monkey embryos. Their plan was to create monkeys born with human-like body parts. Data shows thousands of U.S. patients die each year while waiting for organ transplants. These scientists believe if the experiment succeeds, those patients might be able to survive. But the experiment failed. Most of the embryos died shortly afterwards, and the rest were destroyed within 3 weeks. The experiment has raised difficult ethical questions. U.S. media NPR says the biggest concern is that someone can make a baby out of an embryo made this way. Some critics worry that human cells can become part of the brain of the resulting animal. Rice University's Kirsten Matthews says it is difficult to regulate the new creature once it's born. Should it be treated as a human or an animal? Another concern is that using human cells this way could potentially produce animals with human sperm or eggs. Stanford University's bioethicist Hank Greeley says nobody wants monkeys walking around with human eggs or sperm inside of them. Human rights lawyers in China have arguably one of the riskiest jobs out there. That's because they may end up facing criminal charges themselves if authorities don't take kindly to their defense. NTD's Penny Zhou spoke with one who just fled communist China. He tells NTD about what the justice system really looks like inside China.
A video taken inside a Chinese court hearing sheds light on corruption in the country's justice system. It was first posted online in May 2019. In the clip, a defense lawyer attempts to present his argument, but is repeatedly cut off by the judge. And eventually thrown out of the court. The video provoked strong public criticism against the court. The response forced authorities to take down the video. The lawyer shown in the clip is named Wu Shaoping. He is known to have taken on some of the most sensitive legal cases in China, often representing political dissidents, those attempting to sue authorities, and religious groups facing suppression. He says the Chinese regime considers him a troublemaker.
They summon me quite often to talk with them, to drink tea with them.
In mainland China, if authorities invite you for tea, don't expect a cup of oolong when you arrive. The term usually means they are actually inviting someone to an interrogation with the state security police.
The Ministry of Justice would call and say, "We're watching your case, so don't make trouble for us."
Wu says authorities are mainly concerned with keeping sensitive cases quiet and will threaten lawyers not to draw public attention to them or challenge the court's rulings. China's constitution states that court must exercise judicial power independently. But Wu explains that behind the scenes, the Chinese Communist Party's Political and Legal Affairs Commission is often calling the shots.
How does the party direct the case? How does the party look at the case? Okay, then that's how this case will be characterized and how offenders will be sentenced. So they're not following due process.
In China, human rights lawyers like Wu can sometimes find their positions changing from defense lawyer to defendant. It's been called China's war on law, and it means using the judicial system against those who practice and interpret the law. One major example came in 2015, when more than 200 civil rights lawyers were arrested nationwide, while another batch of mass arrests came years later in 2019, after dozens of lawyers and citizens gathered for dinner in the southern city of Xiamen. Wu was among those who attended the 2019 dinner, but he's one of the lucky ones and managed to escape China last year. Many others have been or are still in prison, and some reportedly face torture methods. So why do Chinese authorities work so hard to silence these lawyers?
We were only trying to defend people's rights according to the existing rules under China's current system, that's all. But you'll find that even if you do things this way, in authorities' eyes, you're challenging them. Though in essence, I'm really just talking to you about the law, right? So if that's the case, what is Chinese law ultimately? I really can't understand. Why do they make laws? I think they really truthfully practice Marxist theory, which says the law is nothing but a tool of the ruling class.
In the video where Wu was thrown out of the court, he had been representing a practitioner of spiritual group Falun Gong. Authorities charged the nearly 70-year-old man with inciting subversion of state power.
The ordinary people, they have no guns, nor any resources. They don't hold any authority. So how is it possible for them to subvert the regime?
Another of Wu's clients is a petitioner seeking justice from the regime. That's after his property was forcefully demolished by order of local officials. Wu said his client was beaten up by police and later detained inside a hotel, where a dozen men kept watch on him.
Before, when I read things like this online, I also didn't believe they could happen. But after I personally represented these cases, I realized it's really happening. China's so-called stability maintenance system is really a horrible thing. It not only wastes lots of taxpayer dollars, lots of social resources, but it also can't solve social problems. Instead, it creates more problems.
He says he's also noticed some other bad signs. Because many injustices aren't addressed, the citizens have no way to challenge the authorities. Some Chinese people have started turning to extreme methods of venting their anger.
For example, committing suicide. The suicide rate is very high in recent years. Some even lead their entire family to commit suicide. And another way is to take revenge on society, like driving a bus into a river or taking a knife into the streets and randomly killing people.
Wu pointed out that it's getting harder to see negative news like this gain traction or publicity inside China. That's as the regime tightens its control over the media and social media.
But these social conflicts are still culminating here. You just don't know when they'll be provoked. Society is now like a high-pressure cooker. The pressure keeps rising, and you don't know when it'll explode.
He added that many in the West tend to focus on China's attractive infrastructure and skyscrapers and judge it positively based on its appearance, but says that doesn't tell the whole truth.
This may be related to human nature. People can easily get mesmerized by beautiful things. But isn't this beauty also poisonous? Aren't there dirty and despicable things behind it? This seemingly beautiful scene comes from the huge sacrifices made by ordinary Chinese people. Behind it is the blood and tears of many people.
Last year, Chinese Premier Li Keqiang said that more than 40% of the country's population made the equivalent of less than $140 a month. For them, it's already a challenge to afford a car and drive on the beautiful highways built by their tax money, let alone shop inside the country's luxury skyscrapers.
The life that many foreigners experience in China is completely different from the life most ordinary Chinese people experience.
Wu said being a lawyer in China is actually quite profitable and comfortable, but taking on human rights cases brings on a very different result.
Like you said, it's an investment with a negative return. You could have made good money, lived a good life, so why not? I think, in one word, people have different ambitions. For me, money is not the most important thing. Even if I can't be a lawyer, I'll be happy to live in a society where China has freedom, democracy, justice, and love. People are all still spiritual beings. If happiness is only measured by the amount of wealth you own, I went to ask Jack Ma, is he happy or not? He's one of the richest people in China. But I believe that Jack Ma is almost certainly unhappy, right?
Wu says Chinese society's current state isn't sustainable. He also believes that many Chinese people are ready for a change.
Once the regime's control model fails or loses some of its power, or when people have let go of their fears, you'll find that they will easily accept the real enlightenment. I believe that day will come.
Penny Zhou, NTD News.
Chinese couples are becoming more reluctant to have children due to the rising cost of healthcare, education, and housing, and social trends in family building. That's based on data from China's Ministry of Public Security. It says the number of newborns in the country dropped 15% last year from the year before. In Guangzhou, one of the country's major cities, authorities recorded last year the lowest birth rate in the last 10 years, only 2/3 of the newborns compared to 2017. Experts cite multiple reasons for the decrease. A Peking University professor lists a few of them: high housing prices and education costs, more women working, and a shortage of daycare centers. But Shanghai-based economist Andy Xie writes that more factors are at play. He described his reasoning in an editorial published by Hong Kong-based newspaper the South China Morning Post. Xie claims low birth rates had little to do with the pandemic. This is because nationwide lockdowns only began around last February. Instead, he says the most important factor is that the adult children of migrant workers would rather browse the web than have their own children. He explains this generation isn't looking for the same lifestyle their parents had, who worked in factories and on construction sites to support their families. China has about 300 million migrant workers. Low marriage rates and high divorce rates are also considered to be reasons for lower birth rates. China-based economist Ren Jieping says in his new report that fewer Chinese people are getting married. In 2020, registered marriages fell 40% compared to 2018. Those who still believe in marriage are postponing it, leading to having babies at a later date. If a woman delays getting pregnant for the first time 1 month, her fertility rate will drop by about 8%. The report says more married couples end up in divorce. Couples reported their divorce in 2020 were 6 times as much as 1987. Beijing is expected to release official 2020 population data in April. And that's all for today's China in Focus. Thanks for watching and see you tomorrow.